Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. If we asked you which you wanted us to dig into it, a lot of you are really interested in this whole thing with Donald Trump. Now that he's back in the White House, and specifically, what he's saying or not saying about like cost of living issues. Stuff that affects working class folks. And it's interesting because like during the campaign, this was like his big thing, right? But now it's kind of like, crickets. So we've got a Reddit thread and this opinion piece to look at today. And, they definitely have some different perspectives.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift. And I think a lot of people are wondering what's going on.
Right. Okay, so let's start with this Reddit thread. It's from ESAN Politics, so as you might guess. Let's just say people aren't exactly buying this whole, Trump is a champion of the working class thing. A lot of the comments are basically saying that his appeal was more about like cultural anxieties, like people feeling like they're being left behind.
Yeah.
And less about,
Yeah.
actually wanting to help them economically.
That's a really important point to bring up. I mean, we see this a lot where economic issues get all tangled up with these cultural anxieties. People feel like their whole way of life is under threat. And they see these economic problems as like a symptom of that.
Yeah, like it's this feeling of things used to be better and we need to go back to that.
Exactly. And so when you have a leader who comes along and taps into that feeling and promises to like restore order and make things safe again, people are drawn to that, even if their solutions don't really address the underlying economic issues.
Yeah. And there's some comments in this thread that really kind of nail that feeling. Like one person compared Trump supporters to sheep following a wolf, even though they know they're going to get eaten.
It's a pretty stark analogy, but it does show you the power of belief. Sometimes people really want to believe in something, even if it goes against what might actually be best for them.
And speaking of wolves, someone else brought up that I love the poorly educated quote, which, by the way, according to Snopes, is totally real. So much for being a champion of the working class right now.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely raises questions about how genuine he was when he was reaching out to those voters. Was he really concerned about them? Or was it more about using their anxieties to get ahead politically?
It's a tough question. And then you have things like the Teamsters Union supporting Trump, even though some of his policies could actually hurt their members.
That's interesting, right? It really shows how sometimes these cultural issues can be more important to people than their own economic self-interest. They'd rather side with someone who shares their values than someone who might actually be better for them economically.
So just from this Reddit thread, it seems like there's a lot of disillusionment out there among people who thought Trump would be their guy.
Yeah, and that kind of disillusionment can be really powerful, especially when it feels like a betrayal, like you were promised something, and then it wasn't delivered. It can make people cynical, not just about one politician, but about the whole system.
And that brings us to this opinion piece, which takes a bit of a different angle. It argues that Trump's now all about what it calls vanity projects, like trying to buy Greenland or get the Panama Canal back. And meanwhile, he's totally ignoring the everyday struggles of the people who put him in office.
Those were definitely some attention-grabbing headlines, but I think we need to look past the sensationalism of it all and ask what's really going on here. Is this some kind of strategy, or is this just Trump being Trump?
Right. Like, is he trying to distract people from the promises he hasn't kept?
Yeah.
Or does he actually believe in these ideas? Maybe he's even trying to appeal to a different part of his base now, like maybe some wealthier folks who see these projects as bold and visionary.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because when you look at the details in this opinion piece, it doesn't seem like these vanity projects are really what his core working class supporters need.
You're right. The piece actually points out that some of his policies, like cutting government funding and expanding those H-1B visas, could actually hurt the very people who voted for him.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really interesting. So it seems like there's this disconnect between what Trump was saying on the campaign trail, all that stuff that really resonated with working class voters, and what he's actually doing now that he's in office.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This opinion piece actually compares this whole pattern to some of Trump's business dealings in the past.
Right. The article talks about times when Trump made promises and then didn't keep them. And then when things went wrong, he always blamed someone else. So they're suggesting that what we're seeing now with his policies could be part of a bigger pattern of behavior.
So are they saying that the people who believed in Trump are basically being fooled again?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the word fooled. I mean, people's reasons for supporting a candidate are complicated. For some people, it's about cultural alignment, like they feel like the candidate shares their values. And for others, it might be about wanting change. They're just tired of the way things are.
Okay, I get that. But what about the people who really thought that Trump would fight for their economic interests? What happens when they realize he's not going to do that?
That's the big question, right? What happens to those voters? Do they get disillusioned with the whole political process? Do they switch sides and support someone else? Or do they just keep supporting Trump and hope that things will eventually change?
It makes you think about how our democracy works and how people participate in it.
For sure. And it's something that's always changing. The media, social media, personal experiences, it all plays a role. And speaking of the media, this opinion piece actually criticizes the media's role in all of this.
Yeah, it says that the media is too focused on Trump's crazy statements and those vanity projects we were talking about. And they're not holding him accountable for what he's doing or not doing on issues that affect working class people. Is there any truth to that?
Well, the media does love a good story. Conflict and controversy get people's attention. And Trump is really good at creating that.
It's like he's still running a reality TV show. And the media just can't resist playing along.
There's definitely some of that going on. And the problem is that while everyone's focused on the drama, the real issues that matter to people get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, like the rising cost of groceries, stagnant wages, healthcare costs. That's the stuff that people are dealing with every day.
Exactly. And when those issues get ignored because everyone's too busy talking about political theater, well, that's a real disservice to the public.
So what can we do? If Trump's not going to help and the media is more interested in entertainment than information, what hope is there for the working class?
Well, I think it's important to remember that change doesn't always come from the top down. Throughout history, we've seen grassroots movements and community organizing efforts that have made a real difference.
You're talking about people taking action themselves, organizing in their own communities, and fighting for what they believe in.
Exactly. When people feel like those in power aren't listening, they find ways to make their own voices heard. We've seen it with labor rights, civil rights, social justice.
So even if Trump doesn't step up, there are other ways for working class people to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key takeaway from all of this. We can't just sit around and wait for politicians to solve our problems. We need to be active and involved in shaping our own future.
That's a powerful message. I think our listeners will really appreciate that. But we've still got a lot to talk about. We've covered the disconnect between Trump's promises and his actions, the media's role in all of this, and the potential for grassroots movements to create change.
Right. And there's one more thing we need to discuss. The actual consequences of Trump's policies on the working class.
Yeah, we've kind of danced around that. But we need to really look at the tangible impact, both in the short term and the long term.
Exactly. What does all this mean for the people whose lives are directly affected by these decisions? Let's dive into that next.
All right, so we've been talking about this whole thing with Trump and his campaign promises and what he's actually doing now. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What does all this mean for working class people? Like, what's the actual impact on their lives?
Yeah, we need to look at the real-world consequences of these policies.
And you know the sources you gave us. They point to some pretty worrying stuff. We talked about those government cuts earlier. Let's dig a little deeper. This opinion piece mentions that Trump wants to slash funding for things like food stamps, school lunches, even support for rural hospitals.
And those programs are really important. They provide a safety net for a lot of working class families, especially in rural areas, where resources are already stretched thin. Cutting those programs would make it so much harder for people to put food on the table, to get health care, to just take care of their families.
It seems kind of backwards to me. Cutting programs that help people who are already struggling, wouldn't that just make things worse?
Well, the people who support these cuts, they say it's about reducing government spending and boosting the economy. But critics argue that it's really going to hurt the most vulnerable people. And in the long run, it could actually make it harder for people to improve their economic situation.
So there's a real debate about whether these cuts are effective or even ethical. And it's not just about government programs either. This opinion piece also brings up those H-1B visas.
Right. That's the program that lets U.S. companies hire foreign workers for specialized jobs. Now, some people say this is good because it helps businesses find the skilled workers they need and stay competitive. But others worry that it could drive down wages and lead to American workers losing their jobs, especially in fields like tech and engineering.
It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
There are valid points on both sides. But I think it's super important to talk about what this means for American workers, especially the ones who are already struggling.
I agree. We can't just ignore the potential impact on people's lives when we're making these kinds of policy decisions. And it's interesting, when you go back to that Reddit thread, you see a lot of people expressing this feeling of disillusionment, like the system is rigged against them.
Yeah, a lot of the comments are about how politicians don't care about ordinary people. They're just looking out for themselves or for their rich donors.
And that kind of cynicism can be really damaging. When people lose faith in the system, they stop participating. And that just makes it harder to address their concerns.
It's a vicious cycle. One commenter even said that Trump's whole presidency is about enriching himself and his buddies while distracting everyone with these crazy schemes and all those culture war fights.
That's a pretty cynical view, but I think it's important to acknowledge that. There are legitimate concerns about conflicts of interest and the influence of money in politics.
So even if we don't go that far, there's still a crone about whether Trump's actions are really in the best interest of the working class. The people who helped get him elected.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big question. If Trump doesn't come through on his promises, if his policies actually hurt the working class, will they even care? Or are they so focused on these cultural issues that they're willing to overlook the economic stuff?
That's a tough one. I don't know if there's an easy answer.
This deep dive has really highlighted just how complicated all of this is. The relationship between politicians and the people they represent. It's not always straightforward.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and watch. We need to be informed. We need to be engaged. And we need to hold our leaders accountable.
We need to demand solutions that actually work and be active in creating the kind of future we want.
Well said. Well, I think that about wraps things up for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more we know, the better equipped we are to deal with the challenges we face.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.